Hey, DCL podcast fans, if you're listening to this podcast October 16th when it comes out, that is the actual 100th anniversary of the Walt Disney Company. Just an amazing company with so many different pinnacle moments that has brought it to its point where we are today. And we are super excited to bring this interview with author Jeff Kober to you. He has come out with his latest book, A Century of Powerful Disney Insights, Volume 1, 1923 to 1973, the Walt and Roy Disney years. And I was really excited when he reached out to us to come on and not only talk about this book, but just talk about some of the different aspects and important moments of those first 50 years within the Disney Company. So I hope you enjoyed this interview. We touch on a lot of different points, and I really once again want to thank Jeff for coming on and enlightening us with so many different stories around the Walt Disney Company. So as they say, on with the show. Well, welcome back to the DCL podcast, your podcast to help you cruise a little smarter. And I'd like to welcome back to the show all the way down in Florida. How you doing today, Christy?
I am well, Steve. I'm better than you are today.
Yeah, I've got your cold. I don't know how I got it all the way across the country, but somehow it made its way through the interwebs, and now I've got a little bit of a head cold I'm fighting off. But we're gonna really endeavor to struggle through this today. And we've got a great guest. There's a birthday coming up that we are going to talk about, which is super exciting. But before we do that, I think you had an announcement about the Australia cruises or something.
Well, it's less of an announcement, but more, maybe it's an announcement. An interesting email that I received. I have a client doing the Trans-Pacific, and we received an email for her talking about her making her reservations, because she'll make her reservations for her cruise line activities in a week or so. And they crossed the international date line. And so they're repeating a day of the cruise twice. So like February 22nd occurs twice, which is just fascinating to me. I just think the international date line is so fun. So basically, Disney has put out that they're going to be able to make their reservations when they do their normal reservations for the first February 22nd date. The second February 22nd date can't be made until they're on the ship. And it'll open up on February 22nd. And then they said that the second February 22nd activities are going to be very similar to the first February 22nd activities. And so if you wanted to go to a wine tasting, you can, and it's offered on the first February 22nd, you can assume that February 22nd will be offered on the second, or the wine tasting will be on the second February 22nd. For whatever reason, I got this email. I'm like, this is fascinating. And I love that there's two February 22nds on their cruise. And I love that Disney's IT can't handle two February 22nds. And so they're just like, we're just going to pretend the second one doesn't exist at first. And then it will the day of.
It's like the Millennium Celebration. The computers just may implode or something like that when it goes from the 22nd to the 22nd. I have this vision of Bill Murray up at captaining the ship saying, don't sail angry. And as they go into Groundhog's Day.
Exactly. This is going to be a February 22nd Groundhog's Day. I was like, I know we're airing this soon. And so I just think it's fascinating.
Yeah, I love it. My aunt, or actually it's my dad's cousin, just got off, or she's still sailing because it takes forever to go from Hawaii to Australia. And she's on Royal Caribbean sailing down there, and they went over the international date line and they gave out a pretty cool little certificate for crossing it. So hopefully Disney will do something special.
I hope so. They do something special for all types of little events. So I assume they'll have this one covered too.
Yeah. Well, should we jump into today's topic and invite our guest into the podcast here?
We should.
All right. I am super excited. This has been on my radar, I guess, as far as what's coming up. And I didn't even realize it's Monday, but there's a birthday on Monday. And I was super excited when one of our listeners reached out to us to come on and talk about his latest book, which he is publishing, celebrating Disney's 100th birthday, which is going to be next week. And I'd like to welcome to the show, super excited about talking to you for the first time, Mr. Jeff Kober. How are you doing today, Jeff?
Greetings. Great. I'm doing super. wish I was going over the international date line right now, but hey,
I mean, maybe not
I'm doing
today.
good.
Today might be good.
Maybe it'll happen tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, when I said birthday, I think a lot of people thought me turning 100, but it's not quite. I'm not quite there yet, but
No.
Moving that way. Jeff, you have a very prolific resume. You've been involved with so many different things. If you don't mind, if you can indulge me here for just a second. For 35 years, Jeff has delivered training solutions for private, public, and nonprofit sectors, ranging from GE, the U.S. Postal System, in the city of New York. He's also honed his consulting activities with the Disney Institute, which I'm excited to hear a little bit about as we start the show, where he was responsible for designing the Disney approach to quality service and service Disney-style programs. He hosts the DisneyAtWork.com, featuring ideas on life, work, from the happiest place. He's also a podcast host, which I was listening to your podcast today that your son interviewed you as I was walking around San Diego, the podcast Disney Insights. And he has penned 3 successful books and is coming out with his latest one now, which we're going to talk about today, A Century of Powerful Disney Insights, Volume 1, 1923 to 1973, The Walt and Roy Disney Years. Once again, welcome to the show, Jeff.
Hey, thank you so much. I do kind of go back a little ways, but not as far back as the company. When I got excited about Disney, I grew up in Phoenix. And so going to Disneyland was the thing. And I got really excited about Disney. And it came to my understanding that Disney was going to celebrate its 50th anniversary. Lo and behold, when I looked into it, I learned that the anniversary for Disney falls on my birthday. And so I'm not 100 this next week, but October 16th, everybody knows D23 for 1923, when the company was established. Very few people know that October 16th is the actual day in which Walt and Roy, with the help of their uncle, took on a contract with Margaret Winkler to do an Alice Comedies. He had already done that in Kansas City, but the whole thing fell apart. He ended up in bankruptcy. He was unemployed, which is all the reason why you ought to buy a first-class railroad ticket and go to California, where his brother was ill from tuberculosis. He convinced his brother to just get out of the hospital, and his brother convinced him that there really might be a market for animation in California, because Walt had already dismissed animation as being a New York City thing. And so he had actually come out to LA to do something else in the movies or something else. Well, the two of them got together and decided, nope, we ought to do animation. They went back to Margaret Winkler. They signed a contract. That was on October 16th. They started in their uncle's garage, kind of assembling whatever Walt had at that moment. He had very little property because of the bankruptcy, but that suitcase in a dream, that if you've seen the not partner statue, but the suitcase in the dream statue at Disney California Adventure, it really speaks to that time period when he came out into California. Fast forward 100 years, and here we are, finally celebrating the day that the organization was established.
So you guys, I am on the Wish this weekend. And so this is going to air potentially the day I'm getting off the Wish, which would be the 100th anniversary of the Disney Company, potentially, right? Or is. And what if my last restaurant was 1923 and I actually wake up to go to breakfast at 1923 on the 100th anniversary of the Walt Disney Company? Now I may have to consider this plan.
If only we knew somebody who was a travel agent that knows how to maybe manipulate things while they're on the cruise.
Yeah, I could request which dining rotation, but I'm going to leave that up to the scheduling gods and let them throw me where I may, because I'm curious where my table. I'm going to let them pick all that. So I'm not making a request, but
leave Marceline's Market and go directly to 1923, just like Walt did, kind of make that sojourney. Anyway, so now we are here at 100 years of the Walt Disney Company. And I felt because I guess we have this connection, and because of my years going back to what you had just described earlier, just a little bit, I actually worked with the Disney Institute, which was responsible for professional development programs, not the Disney Institute of Gardening and rock climbing and cooking classes, but the Disney Institute that involved business programs. And I worked with them for a number of years. And then I went off and started my own company and consulting with other groups, and really just wanted to keep that Disney with me. I live here in Orlando in the area. So I had written a number of books, but as this anniversary came toward, I just felt like somebody's got to write about this. Somebody's got to say something. Somebody's got to do something. So I put a pen to paper. Actually, not most, but so much of my writing crystallized while very early in the morning in Tiana's Lounge on the Wonder while we were on our Alaska cruise, early in the morning, kind of typing and getting things kind of formulated. And it has been a journey to see how this company has unfolded over. There's not a lot of companies that get to celebrate 100 years. Many of them went away. Many of them become amalgamated. They become something else. But the Walt Disney Company is still very much about Walt Disney. And as I wrote this, I realized, oh my gosh, there's so much to talk about. There are lots of books out there about Disney, great books about Walt, great books about Disneyland, great books about Walt Disney World, everything. But there's not been, Disney published a book this year. They kind of handled it topically, but nobody has done this sequence of 100 years. And I felt like this is an opportunity to talk about what these events, when we talk about Silly Symphonies, when we talk about Saludos Amigos, when we talk about ESPN, what does this have to do with Disney? And by the way, what does this have to do with me? And so I've tried to make every segment personalized into a point where you could take away some ahas from the chapter to say, you know what? Think about your own life and think about your own experience. And what is the lessons from this have to do with you? And that's my take on the book. And it got so big, I just finally said to my editor, okay, we're doing 2 volumes here. And so the first volume was released last week, 1923 to 1973, which was really the Walt and Roy years. And then we'll do volume 2 in about 6 months and talk about how this organization just went global. But that's kind of how we kind of got to this place of writing this book.
I think you made so many really cool points there as far as like organizations that over time, either they morph into something else or they disappear. We were actually talking about it as I was flying down here today about different airlines that have gone out of existence. We were talking about Pan Am and TWA. TWA at one point was a sponsor for Disney. And so it is kind of amazing when a company makes it to 100 years like this. And the other thing I will throw out there, which I love because I'm a history kind of nerd, a lot of people just don't know. They see Disney, but they don't really. I've heard this so many times before, and I've witnessed in my own kids that Walt Disney was a man. I mean, there's statues there, but how easy is it sometimes to walk by those statues as you're rushing to Big Thunder or whatever else? And so bringing these stories and illuminating these stories and then using kind of your training and background of the Disney Institute to kind of make it, something that's prolific for each and every one of us as we read these chapters, I think is exciting for people to read your book.
The challenge was really, there's so much to talk about. There's so many people to talk about. And I didn't want to miss, when I got down to actually doing the index at the end, I was like, oh my gosh, this is going to bring on another 8 pages, because there's so many people to credit and to give notice to. But that is probably one of the great messages of the Walt Disney Company, particularly today. It is really a team of people that stretch, thousands of people that really come together to make the magic. And in fact, it follows what is the animation model. When you get down to even the earliest days of Mickey Mouse, or to the Silly Symphonies or Snow White when it was created, artists are such individual talents. They have their own expression. They have their own strengths. They have their own way of putting things out there. And the crazy thing about Disney is that they take all of this talent and they create one piece of art. And that art in motion, it's just, you can't look at it and say, oh, this dopey scene was drawn by Ward, and this dopey scene was drawn by, Hamlucy or whoever. It's all just dopey, or it's all just Alice, or it's all Peter Pan. And it just, I think bringing all of these great talents together to create, and the same thing happens in the parks or on the ships, it's that you take all of this talent and you bring it together and you create one amazing new whole, something you can't have any other way if you didn't bring all that talent together.
You touched upon Walt taking Roy out of the hospital, basically, and working together to get this company going. Obviously partners, although I would definitely want to touch on why Roy gets no credit for anything. But how did they work together? Like, were they true partners? What can you tell us about that?
There would not be a Walt Disney Company today if there had not been a Roy Disney underscoring the whole thing. It would never have succeeded. Walt would have, there were so many wonderful opportunities for the entire thing to absolutely collapse. There were so many people willing to take advantage of Walt. There were so many challenges in technology. There were so many new innovations to be done that if somebody hadn't been writing the checks and figuring out how to pay for it, and also, by the way, kind of going to his brother and saying, you got to be real here. You got to be, one of his, because this is a cruise line, one of the big things about Roy is at one point, not long after, kind of between the Mickey Mouse event and Snow White, Walt started to kind of have a nervous breakdown. And Roy basically said, you need to get it straightened out. You need to get this figured out, because you can't take everybody down with you. And that's when he took Lily, and they went on their big trip that ended up, they wanted to go to Mississippi and ride a stern wheeler, but that had gone out of business in the Depression. So they ended up they went to DC, I think it was, or New York, and then they went down to Florida. They took a cruise ship to Cuba, and they sailed through the Panama Canal. It was actually he had been on a ship, I think, with World War I when he was in the Red Cross, but he had to figure out how to get away and to rebuild himself. But it goes on so many levels. The two of them, and I like to say it's show business. It's show and it's business. And Walt was the master showman.
And is that why the company was named after him?
Well, you know what? It is a lot. It is really due in a lot to, I think, Roy's humility. I think Roy really was, well, he says he was honest. If it had not been for Walt, I'd be a teller in a bank. And this would just be a job. And so and there was a time when, because Walt just, at one point, they had to create a corporation, and that corporation means stockholders and a board of directors. And now Walt had to answer to these people. Walt didn't like to answer to anybody. Roy kept saying, well, he's got a shareholder meeting. We got to talk to him. Yeah. And so Walt would try to create other ways of getting around them. He built Retlaw, which allowed him to, among other things, do some work on the side, which didn't make him beholden. Imagineering, which was WED, Walter Elias Disney, that began as Walt's company, not as part of Walt Disney Productions at that time. And Roy had to keep bringing that in. There was a real conflict just in the years prior to the New York World's Fair, where they really came to a standstill.
When was the New York's World Fair?
That was 1964-65. So this event was kind of in preparation for that, because they had to Walt was bringing on like 300 people under WED. And Roy's like, you got a whole different company going on here, and we got to deal with this. But at the end of the day, Roy walked in. It's one of the last stories I shared. I felt a very impressed. In fact, I was actually talking about in the book, I talk about It's the Small World. And I talk about some elements of that, but I talk about the Sherman brothers and the fact that they, unbeknownst to everybody, had conflict with each other and didn't want to associate with each other after hours. Walt and Roy had a conflict during this same period. And it finally took Roy, bless his heart, his humility is what allowed him to finally give in to, not give in, but work it out with Walt. And at the end, there's an experience where Walt brings an authentic Native American peace pipe and gives it to his brother Roy as a peace offering. And it was very token of the fact that they knew they needed each other. They were a part of each other. But boy, Roy, his goal in life was to get out of debt. Walt could care less about money. He really did not care about amassing money. He was constantly thinking of things he wanted to build and do, and there was not enough time to do it.
How do you research this book? Like where do you, because already fascinating stories, which I don't know if everybody else out there is like, obviously everybody knows this, but like, to me, it's fascinating. And it's, that there's history out there, but like, I am so intrigued. How do you sit down and research this? Are you going to the Smithsonian? Is it at the Smithsonian? Like, where are you getting this information?
I tell you what sparked my love of Disney. It truly began. My youngest memory of my father was carrying me down Main Street after the fireworks. That's my youngest memory. But fast forward a couple of years, I was in 5th grade and I was in the library. It was a rainy day in Phoenix. You don't have a lot of those. And I found this National Geographic article called The Magical Worlds of Walt Disney. And it absolutely transformed me. And even when the sun came back out, I kept going back to the library day after day to read this. It had a full blowout image of Disneyland, and it showed the animation process, and it showed what Lincoln looked like without skin on, and all of these things. And I was so blown away. I finally got the courage to turn to the librarian and say, could I please have this magazine? And bless her heart, she gave it to me. It was my first. Now, if I were to turn my laptop, you would see what essentially is 10 shelving units of Disney books that have grown over the decades. Christopher Finch's definitive The Art of Walt Disney came out one Christmas. It was $55 at a Broadway department store. That was unheard of money for a Christmas gift in the 70s. I begged my parents. I got underwear and I got the book. and that book, and you know what? Actually, I took clips from that. Plus, actually, my thesis was on Disney educational media. And so I spent time in the archives back in the Dave Smith days, back when it was in the Royal Disney building, and literally was in the archives and doing all this. And then, of course, my years with the Walt Disney Company itself, and it just goes on and on. So yeah, I love doing this.
How do you get in the archives? Like, I will go get a master's or a PhD. I will not, everybody. Let's be clear about that. But like, if you get one, can you go in? I'm guessing not. But how do you get in there?
You know what? At that point in time, I mean, this was back in the 80s, but at that point in time, I wrote, and I knew this was my thesis. And I knew if I didn't get approval from Dave Smith, that wouldn't have happened as a thesis. And I thought my life changed when he said yes. He was so gracious, and so were the other members of the team. And you dig deep. But the archives has grown, and it's so considerably bigger. And yeah, it's just kind of crazy. Dave was hired by Royal Disney, right? Not long after Walt's death. And his first job, Dave Smith's first job, was to actually go into Walt's office, which had not been touched, and literally archive every piece and make sure that it all was in the exact same order and everything was accounted for and stayed there. And then in the 50th anniversary of the company, they premiered what was the Walt Disney Story at both Walt Disney World and at Disneyland. And at Disneyland, they had both of Walt's offices, and they literally set it up with his entire office displayed. Now, that actually also, you saw a setup of that at One Man's Dream back at Disney's Hollywood Studios. One of those offices actually was transferred there. So, and that was done because when Michael came in, he just took over those offices until the Team Disney building was built. At any rate, the long and short is a couple of years ago, Bob Iger said, let's reassemble all this. And so visitors to the studios on VIP tours can actually walk and see the original offices of Walt Disney as they were. And the D23 show behind the attractions? No, or is it? It's one of those D23 shows actually will walk you through what the offices were. But and you know what? His office was fairly modest. Roy's office was the floor below. His office was, for a Hollywood mogul, was a pretty humble office, all things considered. And I talk about the heyday of Hollywood, and I compare Walt Disney to MGM and how they kind of compared at the time, because Walt was never about position. Walt was never about money. Walt was absolutely focused on a particular project or set of goals that he had, and everything was riveted toward that. And he had no patience for any employee or staff member that didn't feel the same way. I mean, he was not the person who would say, hey, good job. He didn't give you the rah-rah and recognition. What he did usually just said, all right, that'll work, But what he did is he gave his recognition to artists was giving them great projects to work on and great opportunities to develop and grow and build. And he constantly worked to develop his employees, setting up a training school for them so that they could have an opportunity to learn how to improve and so forth. He was all about taking it to the next level. That was his focus, and he just kept driving toward that.
I love the way your book kind of follows that timeline from the beginning of the company until 1973, and touching on so many different aspects of it. I'm sure you've been to the Walt Disney Family Museum.
You know what? I did when it was under construction, and I have not been back to San Francisco. So I've got to figure out how to do that and connect it, because that's on my bucket list big time.
And they do an amazing job there, kind of following that timeline of Walt's life and where the company went. I'm kind of wondering, Jeff, I'm wondering as I look at this book and think about what you've written, were there moments that stand out that were more important than others in the story from 1923 to 1973?
Snow White is definitely one of those pivotal moments. It was considered to be the folly of him. Nobody thought at that point that because he had rights to Technicolor at that point in animation, there had only been one regular feature-length film that had used color, and now he was going to do an animated film in color that was full-length. People didn't think you could sit that long. Your eyes would strain. It's probably why you see more of a softer palette of colors in Snow White. They ran out of money. They ran out of money again. There's a great story about one of the heads of Bank of America coming on a weekend day to watch the reels, and Walt had to act out portions because it was all finished and so forth, and kind of showed whatever he had at that point. And the banker said nothing. And he got up to leave and went out to the car. Walt followed him to the car. He said, so what did you think? And the banker just looked at him and said, that is going to make you a boatload of money. And it did. It did. For what was 17 cents for a ticket back then for an adult, 17, 18 cents. They made $8 million and allowed him to build his studio. But that unfortunately came around the time of the war. And those were the 40s were very hard years for Walt. Cinderella came around, and basically that was a make it break it point too, where if they couldn't win on a princess film, they weren't going to move forward. And it was a princess film. So yeah, thank goodness for princesses. And it regenerated them to move forward and the movement into live action, and then television. He kept going to television. He did a couple of television specials over 2 Christmases, one for NBC, one for CBS. And he kept pitching, and they wanted him to do television. And they were like, well, they wanted him to do television, but he kept talking about this Mickey Mouse park he wanted to build. And they weren't connecting at all. And finally, ABC said, okay, whatever, we'll take a share of Disneyland, or we'll invest in Disneyland. You build us. So what does he do? He builds a TV show based on Disneyland, showcases Fantasyland with cartoons, and Adventureland with True Life Adventures, and Frontierland with Davy Crockett. And he's promoted the whole thing by the time Disneyland's open. So everybody's coming. Disneyland, of course, takes him to a whole nother place. And from there, it doesn't stop. By the time he'd gotten to Mary Poppins, people understood that, yeah, he's got it. He knows what he's doing, and he succeeds. So those are pivotal moments. And then another pivotal moment is he dies. Not timely. It shouldn't have been surprising given what we know about cigarette smoking, but he dies. And Roy has to pick up the pieces. And that is a pivotal moment for the organization. Roy could have closed off animation at that point. Roy could have sold all the property in Florida, having never put a shovel to it, and he would have made a profit on that property. Made a great profit just selling the property. But he went with his brother's dream and built it.
They do such an amazing job in the Walt Disney Family Museum to not showcase isn't the right word, but to show Walt's passing and what it meant to the world. And they have all these different articles and TV shows, little clips and everything like that to kind of showcase that. I want to come back to Roy here in a second, but how did the rest of the employees respond to Walt's death?
Well, there's a great little story that Van France, who helped create the original training for Disneyland, he tells this great story that at the end of that first day when Lily insisted that the park be open. The only thing you knew was a half mast, and at the end of the day, the band played When You Wish Upon a Star. The employees are in shock. And several of them head over to the Disneyland Hotel, to probably what was the Monorail bar at the time. And they're sitting there drinking. And somebody notices for many years at Christmas time, there used to be this big star that sat on top of Matterhorn Mountain, and it would light up and it would turn around. And somebody was they were all just chatting, and he looked at that and said, hey, the star's not working. And he said, yeah, I don't think that thing's ever going to work. I don't think we're going to make that thing succeed long term. And then somebody else said, you wouldn't have said that if Walt was present. That began in Van France's mind the first time somebody said, what would Walt do? And that started that whole period of thinking, what would Walt do? The good news is that many of the really great traditions, in fact, traditions that new cast members, that whole title traditions came the day Walt died, because it was Dick Nunes's idea that we should hold to the heritage of the organization. So it's been called Disney Traditions ever since the day of his death. But it also created a problem, because they started to do just the same thing that Walt had done before. Ward Kimball understood that what Walt would have done is to have done something new, something out of the box, but they got themselves into a rut as they went into the 70s and early 80s, because they just kind of kept repeating themselves. And they had some good hits, like The Love Bug, which came out, but then they repeated it with a whole bunch of other Herbies. And that was just, I actually toured the studios the first time when I was 16. And I remember the first thing I saw when I walked on the lot was this dumping ground of Herbie parts, that were all gathered there. The other thing I noticed, and this is kind of going into the next decade, but although it was in the 70s, was we weren't allowed to go on any of the sound stages. And nobody was allowed to go on sound stages. Turned out they were filming this very secretive film that they hoped would be a blockbuster. You probably know it as The Black Hole. It was a bust. It really was. They had, some say that George Lucas had pitched Star Wars to the Disney Company and they turned them down originally. And then he went to 20th Century Fox. Thank goodness we bought that and Lucas. But
that was an expensive
notwithstanding, they just
decision.
repeated themselves by trying to do a sci-fi movie and it didn't work. It didn't work. And that was the problem with that era.
And that's the rest of the story, which is going to come in the next book when Michael Eisner
until Eisner shows up.
But I have to say that, Herbie Goes to Monte Carlo was one of my favorite shows when I was a kid. So they were all, we saw all those movies. I'm dating myself.
Party of One, come this way.
To see those I think it was like 25 cents when I lived in Europe in the little theater on the base that we lived on. But I want you to just touch on, because you hit on a point at the very beginning, Christy, where you said, why doesn't Roy get credit? But you live in Walt Disney World. And if it wasn't for Roy, Walt Disney World wouldn't have been made.
Right.
And he gave his life to it, didn't he, Jeff? And I was wondering if you could kind of touch on that for people that haven't really heard that story.
There were a couple of things going on right before Walt died. Many know the story that the night before, Roy had visited Walt in the hospital, and literally Walt is using ceiling tiles to kind of map out the Florida project and how it was all going to flow. Walt wanted to build this experimental prototype community of tomorrow, which would have been a city. Roy was like, oh my gosh, this is going to kill us. The thing they agreed on at this time was that they would put, and if you're familiar with where Walt Disney World sits, they would put, or with where the Magic Kingdom sits, they would put phase one, the Magic Kingdom, at the top of the property. They could have easily put it at I-4 and 192 and then built whatever afterwards. But they agreed that they would build it at the top of the property, so whatever got built before, they had to drive through to get to it. But that was a very expensive proposition because now Roy had to invest in roads and in canals and lakes and the transportation systems. It got very expensive. Roy wanted to open Walt Disney World without debt. And by the use of bonds and so forth, he actually did open it without debt. $200 million project. But to do that, they had gone into a partnership with USS Steel. And USS Steel had come up with this idea of creating hotels modularly, where they'd build the unit down to the towel racks, then they'd slide the unit right into the Contemporary, the Polynesian, and when they needed to change it out, they'd slide it back out. Well, that never happened. And in fact, the costs and overages with USS Steel was crazy stupid. And worse, they were way behind. They did not know how to run a resort experience. And so after opening, that's October 1st, right? And then the press event later in October. In that November time period, Roy made a very difficult decision. And the painful decision actually met the man who used to run boats out on Bay Lake and Seven Seas. He actually told me a story that one time Roy was his guest and he was all alone. And Roy said, I have a difficult decision to make and I just need some space to think it over. That decision was, I'm going to go into debt and buy out USS Steel and take over the resort, part of the property. He did the Walt Disney thing to do at the end of the day. One of the last things he did was do what Walt would have done. And so that was taken care of. And then the day of the Christmas parade, the family was going to go together. He didn't feel well. While they were gone, he collapsed and died. Family, has really sad moments in December. That ended that period, 2 months after the opening of Walt Disney World, that man gave it all for his brother and understood that even though he felt completely different about money than his brother did, he was going to go ultimately where his brother went. And he did. And Walt Disney World is a testament to that. So when you're driving all the way down World Drive to get to Magic Kingdom, just remember it wasn't making Roy very happy either, but he agreed to do it. And the rest is history.
Oh my gosh, Jeff, so many good stories there. And I love your passion in telling it. I've got one other question, I guess, for you before. I want to touch on the cruise line just a little bit before we end the interview. But was there something that you learned in writing this book that you didn't know? Was there maybe a pinnacle moment, or was there a piece of information that maybe stood out to you that was monumental for this time?
There were a lot of pieces I didn't know. And frankly, you get into things like the silly symphonies and the early days of Oswald the Lucky Rabbit, and I kind of knew the story, but I had to straighten out the story and make it, not only straighten it out in my mind, but tell it in a way that was easy to understand, and gave people the credit they were due for being a part of it. So that was really helpful for me. A personal aha came from me about a month and a half ago, when I was finishing the book, and I was in the chapter dealing with, a couple of chapters I deal with. There were two projects Walt wanted to complete that were more important than any other. One was building out CalArts, which would be a formal, permanent place to train new students in the arts, which, by the way, when you get down to the next generation of artists, they all came from that first generation of CalArts, from John Lasseter to again and again and again. All of them came from CalArts. So thank goodness for CalArts. It gave life to animation at some future point. So that was one thing, how he wanted to give back and do that. The second was this thing called Project X, which was ultimately Walt Disney World. And as I sat and I wrote about this, I thought, okay, this is happening around just as we're going into the New York World's Fair. So 63, 64. I'm thinking, how old is Walt right now? He's my age. And I'm thinking to myself, here's a man. I know I talk to a lot of my peers, and many of them are retired and kind of coasting and doing things. And I'm thinking, here's a man who is just beginning his biggest dreams, just starting. And I got to tell you, that just gave me energy like there was no tomorrow. And so I'm thinking about Project X right now for me. And what does that look like for me? And I invite everybody to ask themselves, what is your Project X? What's your next chapter? And where are you going to give back? Like CalArts, where are you going to give back to others? What does that look like? And I just think that's a big message for a man who ran out of time, but thought, I got to do these two things.
You sure you want to move on from there, Steve?
What a way to kind of end our discussion about, Walt and Roy. And I love the way you frame that, in the sense that not only what do you want to do for you and what is your next big project, but what do you want to do for others? Mm-hmm. And I think that's something that gets missed a lot sometimes in the world today. And I know I do it. A lot of my life gets centered around me, and then around the kids and stuff like that. But there's so much good that we can do out there in the world. And what Walt did with CalArts and being able to give back to the arts community, not just through Disney, but all through the movie, the motion picture industry, and through just the whole, United States, as far as artists being brought into creating things for us. So usually I'm better at turning things, but boy, Jeff, you got me there on that one. That was really profound. I thank you so much for those words.
Well, and the great news is that's the first 50 years. We got 50 more to go. And so many lessons. And let me also say one thing about the last chapter. The last chapter is the 50th anniversary of the company. And guess what? There's a lot of economic problems a lot of political problems, a lot of social issues going on. And it was a struggle. The company had just come off of opening Walt Disney World, and now it was in a recession. And the price of gas went from 25 cents to 75 cents to $1 a gallon, which was astronomical. There was pictures posted in the papers of how empty the parking lots were at Disneyland and Florida. That was a mess, because you had to get people to come all the way down from, and they were struggling to make the 50th work. So now we're here at the 100th. I would like to say that the 100th is going to be the most amazing anniversary ever. I happened to be in the airport a couple of years ago with George Kalogridis. This was before the pandemic, and George was over all of Walt Disney attractions worldwide, particularly at that time. And we were talking, and Star Wars was getting built at Disneyland and Walt Disney World. I said, so I imagine you're pretty excited about Star Wars, opening in both of these parks and the crowd reception and everything. He said, yes, we're concerned about that, but not like we're concerned about the 25th anniversary or the 50th anniversary of Walt Disney World. We think that the crowds are going to be beyond anything we've ever dealt with before, because everybody will want to do. Well, then a little thing called the pandemic came, and they did a celebration. I wish it had been more. I wish we'd gotten Tron done sooner, but you know what? That's just the nature of the game. It's still show business. It's still, at the end of the day, it's a carnival. But what a carnival. What an absolutely amazing carnival. And so if you can look beyond the moment and the craziness and the roller coaster of politics and economics and societal issues, if you look at the broader issue, thank goodness for Walt Disney and Disney. And the fact that at the end of the day, you can go somewhere and just feel good about your life.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff. This has been an amazing conversation, and so many pinnacle moments that you've enlightened us with this. I'm super excited for this book to get out and for people to read it. For people looking to purchase your book, where can they find it?
Yeah, very simple. Amazon. It's a century of powerful Disney insights. Just head over there. It's there. It's available in print right now.
Awesome. And then if people want to follow you and your journey, work with you possibly too, how can they do that? Through your website and then through your podcast?
Yeah, Disney Insights is my podcast and my website, disneyinsights.com. Also, performancejourneys.com is my organization by which I take these messages to hospitals, to government agencies. Can you believe that people in intelligence agencies actually listen to these stories? But they do. And also to just across the board. We have clients everywhere from New York to Singapore. In fact, I could not be more excited about this new ship coming to Singapore. So we gotta take a trip, people, and we gotta do it. Have you guys been to Singapore? You are going to love Singapore if you've never been there. It is amazing and terrific people. We've done programs with them, and yeah, we do programs on leadership and customer service and just how to fix your employees who really want to check out on you and all those kinds of topics and issues. And it's just lots of fun. So feel free to reach out to me.
Well, I don't know if you were part of it then, because you probably weren't, but we actually, our company that I work for, Alaska, had the last CEO had Disney come up and over the years, several times to talk about customer service and how we can work with our customers a lot better too. And with that Disney touch. So I thank you for all that you did when you were at the Disney Institute. And I thank you for what you're doing now to make organizations better. Christy, any final thoughts or any final questions?
I don't think so. I guess my final thought is thank you for coming on and sharing with us and sharing the excitement and maybe reviving some of this excitement that occasionally might waver a bit for us, for Disney as a whole, and just like, I don't know. Now I need to go watch all of those Imagineering stories again on Disney Plus and like scour and see what there is. So I just want to say thank you. Thank you for sharing with us. This was really nice.
Hey, thank you. Thank you for having me on.
The book is A Century of Powerful Disney Insights, Volume 1, 1923 to 1973, The Walt and Roy Disney Years. Look for it at Amazon and wherever you can find books. And we will look forward to reading that. And for the next chapter, which I am sure will be coming out sometime soon. Once again, no pressure there, Jeff.
Yeah, no, I'll go right to work.
But thanks again for coming on. And when you went on a cruise to Alaska, I would love to get your insights on the Disney Cruise Line too. So I'd love to have you come back
would love to talk about Disney Cruise Line anytime, any place. I know I go to your website, or not your website, to your podcast to listen to what everybody else is doing, because next bucket list item is Europe. And we want to do that Mediterranean thing. And we've got a big milestone anniversary coming up. So we got to figure this puppy out. So we're excited, and how can you not be? When I'm aboard a Disney Cruise Line ship, I am surrounded by the heritage of Disney and by some really fun activities. But especially, I can't walk up and down the staircase without feeling the heritage of this company. And I keep thinking, if Walt was here, of all the things, he'd be impressed with the whole organization. But by golly, to think he had ships named after him, that would be beyond imagination for him. To be welcomed aboard by Mickey Mouse, I can't imagine how he would feel. And those ships are worthy of his name.
That iconic Mediterranean sailing too follows his footsteps as he needed that time off when they went there. So so many different insights there that you can kind of bring together. So I'm going to hold you to it. Let's talk about Disney Cruise Line and talk about the ships, because I'd love to get your insights as far as that goes. So, but I think that's going to wrap it up for tonight. Once again, thank you so much, Jeff, for coming on and sharing your insights, your passion. Thank you for what you do for the Disney community. And I just want to wish you all the best and look forward to talking to you soon.
Thanks.
Well, that's going to wrap up our show today. Once again, I really want to thank Jeff for coming on and sharing his insights into the first 50 years of the Disney Company. And please look for his book at Amazon. There will be a link down below in the show notes. And if you want to get a hold of Jeff or follow along with him, once again, you can go to disneyatwork.com and find out all that he has to offer book-wise, and also the seminars he can do for you and your company potentially. So once again, thanks, Jeff, for coming on. As always, we'd like to give a huge shout out to our Patreon supporters. They help bring this show to you each and every week ad-free. If you'd like to find out how you can support our show, you can go to patreon.com/DCLpodcast and find out all the information there. Also want to give a huge shout out to each and every one of you who've taken the time to leave us a review at Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to your podcasts. That helps us get this podcast out and a little bit better known in the Disney cruising, and just the Disney podcasting community in general. Thanks for each and every one who've taken the time to do it. And if you haven't done so, we would appreciate it if you did. Well, we are moving into the fall. The spooky season is upon us. It's kind of fun to walk around our neighborhoods and see all the different Halloween decorations. For those of you heading down to the parks to experience those decorations or sailing on a Disney cruise, which Christy is, and she's getting off today from the beautiful Disney Wish, or if you're headed on Adventures by Disney, on behalf of all of us here at the DCL Podcast, myself, Steve, Christy, Nova, and Lake, we want to wish you to be well, enjoy time with family and friends, and we'll see you next time on the DCL Podcast. Goodbye, everybody.
The DCL Podcast is not affiliated with the Disney Cruise Line, Walt Disney Company, Adventures by Disney, or Run Disney. All of the opinions expressed on our shows are those of the hosts and the guests who appear on the show. If you have any questions about any of these products, please contact the Walt Disney Company.